Chapter 30. "I think it would be a good idea for us to return to the boat," Damien suggested. "What for?" Daniel argued. "It's been beached somewhere beyond that jungle." He pointed to where the forest used to be. "And it isn't there now, is it?" Damien said, chuckling. "Of course not. You've taken it away, haven't you?" "Daniel, will you stop arguing?" Malou said, berating him. "Damien has other things to do than answering your questions. Besides, we're not here to stay. We're here to join your father in his quest for a better future for us, right?" Daniel nodded, apparently resigned to his fate. "Okay then, everyone, let's get back to some more comfortable quarters, shall we?" Damien said with a snap of his fingers. In a fraction of a second, the little family was back aboard the cruiser, which was now moored at the Key West Marina. Malou looked at the sign atop the front door of the Yachting Club facing her. "Why are we here? Why are we back in Key West? I thought Dan had left this place already. Isn't that what you said?" "Yes, Malou," Damien replied, sitting down at the wheel. "He's left Key West to go back to Solangi's house." "What on earth would he be doing there?" Stefano asked, taking a seat on one of the lounge chairs near the wheelhouse. "Do you remember your father's book?" Damien looked at the four faces staring at him. "Yes," Malou replied. "But why getting that book open again?" "Did your husband have any opportunity to use what he learned while accomplishing all of his tasks?" "No, of course not. He fell back into his past." "Precisely, my dear. He needs to reopen the book now, not to accomplish the tasks, but to remember what he learned." "But I thought you said Dad had regained his memory now," Gabby questioned in turn. "He has regained memories of his past, from the time he was 23 years old, but after that, his future, actually. He only remembers prominent events, and not the details he will need to advance in his new life." "And how long is that going to take?" Daniel asked, sitting down beside Gabby in another lounge chair. "How long is a piece of string, Daniel?" Damien replied, smiling. "Besides, all of us now, including your dad, will be navigating in God's time and space. That means there will be no clock to watch, no days or night to account for, and no space for you to recognize at first sight." "What do you mean?" Gabby asked, intrigued now. "Remember, you three kids are not born yet. What you are experiencing right now, and whatever is to come, will only become memories when you return to 2013. "And why did you send us through that jungle into that clearing?" Stefano inquired. "It was decision time for your dad, Stefano. While he was making up his mind, I thought it best to accompany your time with a little experiment of my own." Damien chuckled again. "But why, Damien, did we really need to face these slithering beasties and spiders?" Gabby demanded. "Life is full of obstacles, my dear, and what you're going to face while following your dad in his progress may be much more annoying and perhaps even more frightening than a harmless snake or a bunch of trotting spiders." "You mean that was only a sample of what you've got in store for us?" Daniel seemed more bothered than ever. "Precisely, Daniel. You have seen war now, but your siblings have yet to face harsh realities." Seeing that their discussion was going to lead nowhere tonight, Malou nodded and said, "Okay, why don't we get downstairs and change our clothes before we have something to eat?" "That's the best idea I've heard all day," Daniel shouted, already rushing down the stairs to the cabin. "I'll be the first in the shower," he added, running to the back of the boat. Dan looked positively ill at ease. He turned to Gustavo. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do this with me?" "Listen, Dan, solitude is one thing, but loneliness is something entirely different. It drives you to all sorts of misdeeds. As a human being, you need to belong somewhere, and me, I don't belong anywhere else but with you. I have made a commitment to stay at your side, and it is a promise I intend to keep." He gazed into Dan's eyes. "So why don't you stop stalling and get on with it?" "Well said," an old fellow sitting in the chair Damien had left moments before said, grinning from ear to ear. "Who are you?" Dan blurted, staring at the man. "Ah, yes. You don't remember me," the latter remarked. "The name is Chippewa, the Dream Maker." He chuckled. Still stunned, Gustavo opened his mouth at last. "Chippewa, you say? Are you here to help Dan?" "Oh yes, Gustavo, and much more in fact." Dressed in cotton trousers, a plaid shirt, leather boots and a tattered hat, this aging man looked all goodness and amiability. His smile, his striking blue eyes, and his full head of white hair inspired trust and joviality. "What about the book here?" Gustavo asked, pointing at the unopened volume in Dan's lap. "Is Dan going to find the answers he's looking for?" "No, Gustavo. The book will give him the tools he needs to forge the future of his choice." Chippewa turned his gaze to Dan. "Let's not waste any more time and open it, will you?" Dan nodded, put the key in the small lock at the side of the book, and as soon as he heard the click indicating the release of the latch, he lifted the cover. The first page was blank, but the second wasn't. "Why don't you read the paragraphs aloud, Dan?" Chippewa suggested, advancing his body to the edge of his chair and placing his forearms on his elbows. "Okay, here goes," Dan replied. "You have been proved worthy of opening this book to this first chapter. Therefore, you are now at liberty to receive the powers of the Dream Maker. Those powers that will enable you to reach the future of your choice and assist you in reaching your goals for you and for your progeny. The first of your tools will demand that you turn your mind toward understanding and tolerance, which will free you from the sin of obsession. What powers is this paragraph referring to? Gustavo asked, lifting his gaze to the dream maker. Is it like magical powers? Chippewa burst out in laughter. No, Gustavo, nothing you and Dan will read in this book, or all the things that Dan will be required to do, will have anything to do with magic. What are these powers, then? Dan asked, his eyes still travelling along the lines of the paragraph. The powers that I will bestow upon you will enable you to use the tools you are receiving while you read the book. Could you give us an example? Gustavo queried. Sure. In this first paragraph, God demands that you turn your mind toward understanding and tolerance and away from obsession, doesn't it? Chippewa fixed his gaze on Dan. Dan nodded. But I believe I am tolerant and understanding, he argued, and I don't think I'm obsessed with anything. Do you now? Interesting. You have been obsessed, Dan, and more so than you want to admit. How? Dan flared. With becoming a Navy pilot, for example. That wasn't an obsession, Dan countered. It's been a dream of mine. No, Dan, your dream was to fly an aircraft, not necessarily become a Navy pilot. Okay, you're right. I thought it was the cheapest and easiest way to get the training I wanted. Exactly my point. Obsession can drive you to using any means possible to attain the desired result. But what about being tolerant and understanding? Gustavo put in. I haven't known Dan for very long, but I've not seen any intolerant behaviour in him. Ah, yes, tolerance resides in direct opposition to intolerance, and the fact that you, Dan, wanted to become a Navy pilot at all costs proves that you wouldn't tolerate any hindering factors coming your way or crossing your path. Could you explain what you just said? Dan asked, getting a little mystified. Okay, when you enlisted to take the training, you saw that only one road ahead of you, becoming the pilot at the control of a fighter jet, right? Dan nodded. Yet you ignored the consequences of the choice you were about to make and become intolerant toward anyone obstructing your path. Is that why you placed the newspaper on the table that night? I personally didn't do it, Dan, but someone had to suggest an alternate route for you, and that someone was well aware of the consequences that could befall you if you resisted in your chosen career. Who was that? Gustavo asked innocently. Chippewa looked at him and smiled. Oh, you mean the one up there? He lifted his gaze to the ceiling. Yes, Gustavo, the one up there had to stop Dan in his decisive path. The three men fell silent for a moment. What about these powers, then? Dan asked again. Whenever you will be faced with a choice, I'll make sure that tolerance and understanding of the consequences that could follow each option will be your only guiding tools. Your mind will no longer be obsessed with attaining your goal without acknowledgement of what hindrances could cost you or your family. So I'll have the power to make wise choices from now on, is that it? Yes, Dan. Should you at any time refuse to see the light or the forest for the tree, you will be recalled to attention instantly. And what will I do in all of this? Gustavo asked Chippewa. Give Dan a nudge when he's about to jump off the cliff, the Dreammaker replied, chuckling. Damianos, having decided that it wasn't an evening for Malou to start cooking, took the family to the marina's closest restaurant. The decor suited the place perfectly. The blue drapes and white tablecloths reminded the patrons of the colour of the ocean and beaches skirting it. The wooden trims around each of the windows set the stage for the view beyond the palm trees fronting the restaurant. It was a comfortable place and a quiet one. Looking around her as she came in, Malou wondered in which year they had landed when they had returned to the cruiser, for the restaurant certainly didn't seem to be a modern one. But soon recalling what Damianos had mentioned about travelling in God's time and place, she instantly dismissed the thought of questioning him. Of course, it wasn't long until their conversation returned to the matter in the forefront of everyone's mind. You said that we were supposed to follow Dad in his progress, Stefano began. But how are we supposed to do that if we're to stay here? Very good question, Damianos replied. You see, and as I mentioned earlier today, your dad is revisiting Salangi's house to read his book. While he's doing that, we will be waiting for him to finish his reading right here. Is it likely to take days? Gabby asked. Didn't I tell you that you are navigating in God's time from now on end? Yes, Damianos, I understand that, Gabby went on. But what I wanted to know was if we needed to prepare ourselves for the trip. No, my dear, there will be nothing to prepare. Once your dad will have read all 12 paragraphs, and once he would have... Which 12 paragraphs are you talking about? Daniel demanded, finishing his ice cream. Let me answer that, Malou interposed, looking at Damianos. He nodded. You see, the book your father is reading right now, as I explained to you when I returned home, contains the description of the 12 tasks that he had to accomplish while we were revisiting our past. Okay, Daniel said, nodding. And why aren't we reading the same thing, since we'll need to follow him? That's the point, Damianos said. You and your family will follow your dad in his progress. You won't be able to intervene. What if we don't like what he's doing? Gabby asked, getting a little annoyed. Your father will make all the decisions in full knowledge of the consequences, Gabby. However, you will be able to express your opinion, such as every one of you will be able to do.